Good morning. I didn't quite realise how committed I was to making the points that I wanted to make today until about 7:30 this morning, when I was sat in my office running through my presentation and the bank phoned, which is never a good thing when the bank phoned at that time. And they proceeded to tell me that last night, whilst I was at the reception enjoying a glass of wine, someone in New York was drawing money out of a cash machine on my credit card, which is a perfect example, and I guess also a perfect example of the issue around crime reporting, because I think it's highly unlikely that either me or First Direct will report that to either the Met or the NYPD or anyone else you might think about. So with that in mind, I am going to be fairly practical about what I think the challenges are around dealing with organised crime and what I think some of the things are that we need to do in the police service. This, to me, is an area where there are significant challenges, but I also think there are significant opportunities if we collectively in the service and with all the people that we work with get our act together. The question is how quickly we can do that. And if I start, because I knew I was coming after an academic, so I thought I'd have to have a good quote in here. So I'll start with Charles Darwin. And the really interesting one for me around Darwin is a lot of people think that what Darwin was saying was it's survival of the fittest. And actually what Darwin said was, it's not the fittest or the strongest or the most intelligent that will survive. It's those that can best manage change. And I think for us as a service, it's how we manage the changes that are happening both externally and what we need to do internally that will give us a chance to actually deal with this issue. And I'm going to cover four areas fairly quickly. The first one is to question whether we actually understand the problem and just test that and raise a few questions around that. Talk a little bit about the new landscape that exists, very new landscape. Some things about the changing nature of the threat as it presents itself. And then lastly, wrap up with what I think the policing response is to some extent and needs to be as we move forward. So do we understand the problem? And I think a lot of people would point to the OCG mapping, and I've been heavily involved in developing the OCG mapping over the last few years. So I am positive about where it's got us to, but I'm also pretty critical about what it doesn't tell us. So the OCG mapping for London will tell you that we have 859 OCGs that we have mapped in London, where there are 908 others that other people have mapped, but they say that's got an impact on London. And if you add that together in people, that gives you about 14,000 nominals, which is volume activity, whichever way you cut it, and quite clearly is not going to be dealt with in a very small way by a small squad or fairly limited activity. But the real area that interests me and that we've been working really hard on for a number of years is what I would call the dark corners, i.e. the places where we kind of know intuitively or instinctively that activity is going on, that criminality is taking place, but we find it really hard to push into those dark corners. We tend to deal with the intelligence that drops into our laps, and we're good at that, and we move that on and we turn that into operational activity, and out of that falls further intelligence and further activity. But we've been working really hard to try and push into some of those darker corners. But that comes with significant resourcing challenges, and it comes with some challenges around whether we've got the ability to task into that and whether we've got the right skills to do that. So there is a challenge there for all of us, and I think it would be dangerous to sit back and say the OCG tells us about organised crime. If we're being honest, it tells us about what we're doing at the moment about organised crime. It's not the full picture. We still have a real challenge around silos, both internally within individual police forces, in between police forces, and in between the police and other agencies and other groups that can help us. Because increasingly, this is not about law enforcement agencies if we're going to take this seriously. It's about working with academia, it's about working with business, it's about working better with government. And so I'll talk about some of that when I get to what I think we need to do. And lastly, there is a capability question. Things are changing, things change very quickly. The kind of skills we need to take on the challenge are different to the kind of skills we may have needed in the past. And so we've got both capacity and, I think, capability. And again, I'll come on to that later. So what's the new landscape? Well, let's start and work our way up. You've got the local force effort, and if I'm being honest, I think that's patchy. It's getting better, but there are forces around the country who would have you believe that they have only a handful of organised crime groups that are operating and impacting in their area, and I don't believe that. That cannot be right. But yet that's the position that forces are taking. Some of that driven around an acknowledgement that they don't have the capacity normally to deal with larger numbers. Some of that driven around the performance regimes that exist in the organisation at the time. This is tricky stuff to measure. It's tricky stuff to measure whether you're doing well or not. We were the first force to go to a PCC arrangement, and I remember Kit Malthouse, who was the first PCC, and at that point I was responsible for organised crime, and I used to sit down regularly with Kit to talk about what we were doing and how it was going, and his question always was, yeah, so tell me, is it getting better or worse in London? And I could never answer that question. It's a really difficult one to answer, and I'll come back to performance regimes in a moment. PCCs was mentioned at the beginning. I think it presents both an opportunity and a threat, the creation of PCCs. I think it presents an opportunity if they understand the impact of organised criminality in their area, if they understand what the service needs to do then, if they're prepared to collaborate in the way that they do that, if they're prepared to extend their influence outside just the police to other partners and agencies. It is a threat if they see organised crime, this vague, sort of amorphous, unmeasurable thing, as not being a vote winner, and they decide that therefore that's not something that they want to put particular resource into. I think there are some real opportunities. Talking last night, one force where by the eradication of really strict tying you down performance measures has allowed some freedom that allows people to look in a more qualitative way, because if you start looking more qualitatively at crime, you will start to find and you will start to hit organised criminality. But not everywhere is the same. And at the moment we don't have consistency, and I think we're only really at the start line now of PCCs now a year into their jobs, starting to push out and see where they want to go and what they want to do. So collectively as a service and through government and through the strategy and through the work that Keith's doing at the NCA, we need to be influencing those PCCs to make sure they understand that this does impact on everybody. You then go down, we've got the regional organised crime units. I know there are people here who represent the regional organised crime units. To me, that is where we need to be going. I guess my concern around the ROCUs is the sustainability. It's very difficult doing things on a 2 or 3 year funding cycle to get the right kind of people in, to get the right kind of skills. And this work takes time to become skilled at. It takes time for people to develop the experience and to broker those relationships. So we need to really think about that. NCA, very, very early days. I think the NCA needs to major really on where it can add value, particularly in the international sphere, in some of the background and the intelligent work the NCA can do. There's a real opportunity for us that we haven't had before. And I think also in starting to work up that top level performance regime around organised criminality is a really important place that the NCA can help. And I'm sure Keith will talk about that. We need to drive more accountability out of partners. My single biggest criticism of the new strategy, and Owen will know I banged on about this in every meeting I went to about it, was I think it should have been used to drag partners to the table more, be they government departments or other broader partners, and make sure they are locked in and seeing organised crime as a responsibility that they have. And I don't think we've fully achieved that. I think you can best see that achieved up in Scotland and the regime up there, where it's a whole government responsibility, but I don't think we managed to land that one, and we need to think that one through. And then lastly, international. Again, NCA will be the pointy end of that, but we all individually as forces have got to work better internationally, better in terms of access to intelligence databases and understanding, and better actually working. And we have, in the last year, had Lithuanian, Romanian, Polish police officers working in London with us, overtly, covertly working with us to deal with issues that emanate from those states. So we've all got to get better at how we see that, and again, it's about those silos. So going on to the nature of the threat, how's it changing? Well, it's increasingly international, and increasingly the nature of much organised crime makes state boundaries irrelevant, quite frankly. But that creates all sorts of challenges for us when you're trying to work cross jurisdictions and trying to get information from other organisations. You look at the foreign national offenders, and you may have seen some of the stuff that we're doing in London around foreign national offenders. We arrest every day around about 800, 1,000 people in London. 200 of those will be foreign nationals. on any given day. About 28% of the people we arrest in London will be foreign nationals, not illegal necessarily, but just foreign nationals. It's about 70,000 people a year, and we know what we know about those people, and that often is not a huge deal that we know about those people. So that instantly gives you a gap in terms of what you're dealing with. And obviously, the international nature of it presents all sorts of operational challenges. On our OCGs that I talked about that we've got mapped, there are 43 nationalities represented within that. And so some of the tactics that we would ordinarily use in terms of covert policing become incredibly difficult when you're dealing with a group that is entirely made up of Lithuanians or Bulgarians or whatever. And so there are all sorts of challenges to our normal tactics, and I'll talk about what we need to do, or what I think we need to do. There's increased business diversification and use of technology. Cyber's always the example that everyone punts out, and I think we need to be really careful about how we try and define cyber. And kind of picking up on some of the comments that Mike made, there is a danger here that we disappear into doing nothing other than trying to define things. And we spend our entire time worrying about, is this or is this not organised crime, is this or is this not cybercrime, instead of actually getting on and doing something about it and attacking the characteristics of the criminality as it presents itself. And all of us, at whatever level, we struggle with trying to define this stuff because we want it neat, because then it neatly fits into part of our organisational structure and it neatly fits into a performance regime. Well, this stuff isn't going to do that. It's going to manifest itself in all sorts of ways, and we've got to be prepared to be flexible about how we try and take that on. And quite frankly, I did write down some of the figures of the estimated costs of cybercrime, but I could probably just stand up here and make up the numbers, quite honestly, and no one in the room would be able to prove or disprove it. And that's part of the problem. And again, we spend our whole time chasing how much. We know it's happening. I know it's happening because it happened to me last night. But the point being, we've just got to get on and look at how we can deal with things rather than disappearing, trying to actually quantify things and define things. It gives you different and often clean players, which is a real challenge for us. So some players for us, and this is where it links down to local, but some players for us are clean because they come from another country and we know nothing about them. If you go into the cyber world, some of the biggest cyber jobs that we ran in the police e-crime unit, the PECU, took you back to a 17-year-old kid sitting in a room somewhere in London who's got no criminal record whatsoever. It's actually quite hard to get a criminal record when you don't go out much more than a couple of hours a day. And they were sat there doing what they were doing and being used by organised criminals. But fascinating thing again about definition in cybercrime, that same person with specialist technical skills might be used by a criminal trying to get money. They might be used by someone trying to destroy someone else's business or reputation. They might be used by someone in a terrorist field. And that's, again, it defies our normal definitions. You're not talking about serious criminals or lower level criminals. You're talking about someone who has a particular skill set that people who have another end will utilise, either by intimidating, by paying, whatever it happens to be. And these people are not on our radar. They're not someone that we have been targeting ordinarily. It also, the threat of corruption, the threat, if so much around this is around information, and so much of this is around information, the vulnerability of all of our organisations to people infiltrating and doing whatever they can do to get information which undermines our efforts is significant. And I don't know whether it's greater or less, but what we need to be doing is focusing on that and focusing on how we protect and defend ourselves against that. Because I, like almost anyone else talking about this, will say we need to have better intelligence, more integrated intelligence, a greater understanding of the links up and down the chain. All of that presents a vulnerability to people. Because intelligence is no use to you if you don't tell anyone about it who's going to go and do something operationally. It's no use knowing about it afterwards and feeling good about that if we didn't do anything. So therefore, it gets spread and you then are vulnerable. We've got diverse and collaborating communities. In London, the change of communities, the movement of communities is bewildering. And what that does, it gives you not only new criminalities, it gives you new criminals coming in, but it also gives the criminals often very fertile victim groups. So if I take Lithuanians, for example, there are probably about 100,000 is the estimate Lithuanians living in London. 50,000 of those people live in one borough, the London borough of Newham. And that is a big community of people who are probably instinctively cautious of the police because of their own cultural and historical experience. and they are a perfect victim group for the Lithuanian criminals. And again, talking about that diversification, if you characterised organised criminals in England, they tend to stay at one level. Lithuanian organised criminals are extraordinarily entrepreneurial. They will be involved in cybercrime, they will be involved in punting out illegal fuel, and then in the evening they'll break into a college to nick some laptops. That's not what you get from our kind of organised criminals, but all of that presents opportunities to you. And we get individuals who operate through the levels, as I said, around cyber, and also seeing gang members moving up. So again, it presents opportunities. So what are the policing response that I think we need to start thinking about? The first one is, and this again is just a reference to the organised crime strategy, it's not a criticism, it's an observation that I think we need to have, is I don't think we want to be too seduced about the CT analogy. And the CT analogy is writ large in that with the prevent or the contest strategy. And I don't necessarily disagree with that in every sense, but the point for me is the important one is this is not as straightforward as the CT threat. The CT threat is a smaller number of people with a relatively uniform objective and a relatively uniform method of operating, or what they want to operate. Organised crime is as diffuse as that is uniform, and we've got to recognise that and not just run down one particular route. We've got to get to more integrated and themed intelligence work. Don't obsess on the individual organised crime groups as the thing that's important. We need to understand the themes and characteristics of organised crime as it presents itself, and we need to integrate both open and closed, and we've done that, I think, quite successfully, but it's been quite hard yards to achieve in the Met around not having all your confy over one point where nobody gets to see at all, and having your open intelligence at the other point. And I sat in a job previously running the Intelligence Bureau where the overt bit would be saying, here's what we think's happening, and I would know from what I knew from the covert bit that that was not precisely accurate. But we weren't mixed, and we've now pushed everything over into being driven in the kind of confy world, but bringing that broader picture, because if we don't understand the picture, we are never going to be able to identify the opportunities to tackle it, and we've got to integrate better between agencies and forces. And I've no doubt that Keith will talk about the Organised Crime Coordination Centre and the work that they can do. We've got to be realistic about the impact on people, businesses, and we've got to be realistic about the offer that law enforcement's making. You can't, Lord Deere said at the beginning, we kind of deal with crime as we've always dealt with crime in this construct of you go and report a crime. You report a crime whether someone's nicked your bike, whether you've been raped, or whether you've had £40 million taken out of an account. It's ridiculous. We can't do that. People won't report in those ways, and they can't expect the same investigation to happen thereafter. So we've got to get much better as a collective and with government to explaining to people that if you get that fraud acted against you, or that cybercrime, or whatever type of organised crime, it may not be a standard the police are going to turn up and start investigating, because that's not what's going to happen. It's not the right thing to do, and it's not going to happen. But we've got to be honest with people, and when we're honest with people and honest about the impacts, we can then start to get them to take it seriously, and that then feeds through politically and PCCs and so on. Perhaps my biggest point, we have got to start taking prevention and disruption options seriously. That is probably the only really affordable way that we can deal with the various threat that comes from organised criminality. And by that I mean environmental crime prevention activity. And the example I always use from what we've had is we had cash in transit running out of control in London, and we've practically eradicated it. And most of that has not been done by us. That's been done by the industry, taking responsibility, by the industry working with us to change practices, developing research and development on hard physical crime prevention like tracking and glue technologies, by us doing less but really effective investigations and making it not worthwhile for the criminals to do. So you get that kind of hard environmental crime reduction. There's lots of clever work gone on, particularly in the economic crime world, in lots of different forces, about getting in and getting what I always describe as left of the crime. A crime happens on a line of a process and time, and the crime is the point where the criminal is able to strike. We've got to get left of that point and stop it, stop the opportunity opening, stop the door being open or the window being open for the burglar, stop the website or your account being vulnerable for the malware. And we've got to do a lot more work than we do on that. And crime prevention in the service is not sexy. People think of old cops handing out locks and you know, telling people to close their sheds. We've got to get it to a point where it is what is actually going to deliver harm reduction, and we can afford to do it, because we cannot afford to run around playing cops and robbers, particularly if the offenders happen to be in Romania at the time, because I'm not going to sign the travel warrant for that. The travel authority. So we've got to get sensible about how we do that, and that's going to be with other people and working with other people. Some of that around lifetime offender management and thinking about how we get in and stop the organised criminals of the future. And a lot of the work we've done around gangs we can do similarly, because again, conversations last night, you know, the people who are going to go and do this grow up in the same environments. The same environments is where they're coming from, and then they see this as their opportunity, and we've got to try and do everything we can do to prevent that. And I know later in talks about bringing this to the local, we can see some of how that works. Breaking down the silos, I've said a lot about, both internally and externally. It's the only thing we can do. The biggest thing we've got to do is we've got to challenge our own method of operating. We like doing this the way we do it, and I've got years of doing it the way we do it, and it's good fun, and I've really enjoyed doing it. But we've got to challenge ourselves and say that isn't going to work. We've got to look at how local policing can help those teams that are dedicated to dealing with organised criminality, and that means we've got to share, and that means we've got to show, and that means we've got to be prepared to work together, because there will be an opportunity that someone can deliver locally that we won't be able to do from a squad or a team, and we've got to see attack from both ends. We've got to ask ourselves, have we got the right type of staff? Have we got people with the right skills? Are we going to have a different profile of people in the future? And I think particularly when you get into cyber economic, I think we absolutely have to have a different mix of people in the future. So where are we going to get those people? How are we going to employ them? They're not going to come and join for 30 years. So it's going to be different, and that feels a little uncomfortable. But that's where we've got to get to if we're really going to do this. Organisational structures I've kind of covered a little bit, and we've got to break out, I think, of our comfortable thing with we like a commodity or a crime type. This team deals with X or Y. The problem is, going back to my quote at the beginning, that's not the way the organised criminals are viewing the world. They are not, I am a drug dealer and forever will be a drug dealer. They are an organised criminal who is running businesses in the illicit side of the line, trying to exploit vulnerabilities. So we've got to be a bit quicker there. So, my summary. I actually think we've made some big strides. And whilst the OCG mapping is not perfect, we actually have a picture to start with, because 3 or 4 years ago, we didn't even have a picture to start with. And that will get better. And as the NCA and the intel side of the NCA develops, that will get better. It will get more sophisticated. We'll be able to cut it in different ways and start to do that kind of thematic work that I've alluded to. I don't think this is a counsel of despair, and Mike's point about you can just look at these enormous scary numbers and imagine that everyone out there is cyber attacking us all the time. It's not true. It's not true, and I think we can't afford to just be caught in the headlights here. There are opportunities as well as there are threats. And if we can get some of that prevention and awareness work done, the latest, if you take the kind of malware attack in, the latest assessment from GCHQ was that 80% of those attacks could be frustrated if we could just get every person to update their Adobe or their JavaScript or whatever when that pops up on your screen at the most irritating moment. Because in cyber terms, that is, you've left the kitchen window open. In burglary terms, that's what you've done. You've left the kitchen window open. And that's where the malware gets in, and then off they go and do their thing. If we could just get everyone out there to do that, you could stop a lot of what goes on. So we've got to get looking at the opportunities, sort ourselves out and work smartly. And then lastly, we've got to be lighter on our feet. We can't afford to get to a stage where something presents and there is a new threat coming, and we then work through a cycle of, well, let's think about this from a policy perspective, and, well, that's going to mean we're going to have to change what we do in the police service, and we're not sure that's in so-and-so's remit. We will not be able to keep up with this if we're not light on our feet in terms of the way we're prepared to change and adapt. And it goes back right to that thing at the beginning. You know, this is not about who's strongest or who's cleverest. It's about who's able to change. And that pace of change is getting quicker all the time as more of this criminality is technology enabled. Thank you.